to the South Asian Welcome to the South Asian Mental Health Festival. I'm Mariam, or Mariam, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it, the events coordinator at South Asian Sisters Speak, or SAS as we like to call it. We're a community platform for South Asian women in the UK. And today we've partnered with Tarakki, Desi Minds, and Expert by Experience to bring you today's festival. The session that we're going to be on today is a panel discussion exploring the variety of mental health experiences within the South Asian community and considering how this intersects with issues such as gender, sexuality, and caste. The discussion today will be chaired by Shirinjeet and myself as co-chair, who I will hand over to in just a moment to introduce himself and our panel. But if you're just joining us, just a quick reminder of our safeguarding values for today, which should be up on the screen very shortly. There we go. So just to quickly run through these are our values for today. So please keep things confidential. You're going to hear personal stories in the session or in the chat where people may be sharing their experiences. So please don't share them outside of this space. Second, this is a non-judgmental space. So please aim to listen to our panelists, read the chat, what people are sharing, and respond to anything you see in the chat with empathy and compassion. Supportive, our team is here to support you should you need us. Please just drop us a message in the chat. And just a quick trigger warning that on that note, I'd like to add that I just want to add a trigger warning for self-harm and suicide, which may be a topic that comes up in the discussion today. But just again, to reiterate our values in light of that, we're here to be supportive, so do need to just drop us a line and keep things confidential and non-judgmental in our area. And just a quick reminder of some practicalities as well. If we just get to the next slide. So how our sessions work, it's completely up to you if you have your camera on or off, depending on what makes you most comfortable. We do recommend watching this in speaker view. So you can find that at the top in the right-hand corner of your screen. It means you'll be able to focus on the speaker. Hopefully we've set it up in a way that you can just see the panelists and the chairs easily, but you can also spotlight specific speakers as well. You can turn closed captioning on as well from the menu bar at the bottom of your screen, so that live captions what people are saying. And also, please feel free to share your thoughts and questions in the chat. We, of course, will not tolerate any abusive or discriminatory language, but we find the chat function to be a really useful place for people to share their experiences, what they think, what the panelists are, what they might resonate with what the panelists are saying, and also to ask any questions that they might have for the panelists or what other people are sharing in the chat as well. So please feel free to use that chat function. But we'll be monitoring that, and just drop us a message, of course, as I said before, if you need anything. And then we'll also have a feedback form that we'll be asking you to fill out. So with that aside, I will now be handing over to Shirinjeet to introduce himself as well as the panel to kick us off today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where we are today around the world. Fantastic. Thank you to Mariam just there for introducing this session, and a huge thank you to everyone in the audience for their commitment and their attendance here today. So today we have a panel on mental health and marginalisation, and we are going to be very shortly introducing our panelists, just getting everything kind of sorted out on the Zoom side. A little quick introduction about myself. My name is Shirinjeet Singh. I'm the founder and director of a movement called Tarakki, which works with Punjabi communities to reshape approaches to mental health. And we're very much looking forward to speaking to the panelists today, hopefully learning and working together to enhance how we approach mental health in our lives. I'm just very quickly going to ask Nikhwat, one of our panelists, to turn his camera on, and then we can spotlight him and bring him into the main screen. Lovely. Here we go, we got him there. And we have another panelist, Ravita, who will introduce herself as well, but got a bit of camera challenges on that side, which means that she can't be spotlighted. So you'll be hearing from Ravita. Ravita is here, and we will kind of go into that very shortly. So first, to get things kicked off, I am going to just ask each panelist to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what they're up to at the moment, what might be relevant to the conversation that we're having here today, and also share one thing which is your go-to kind of self-care practice, or something that you do when when you realize that you need to kind of spend a bit of time on yourself. Mariam will also come back to us at the end of that, because I think it's probably a good question for us to answer as well. But I'm going to go with Raj, then Shah, then Nikhwat, and then Ravita.
Cool. Well, hi everyone, and thanks for joining. It's amazing to see so many of you in the room. And yeah, if you've got any questions, put them in the chat and we'll try and answer them as we go along. I'm Raj. I do a fair bit of stuff online that you might have seen. I'm the founder of the Pink Laddu Project, which is a global campaign to encourage South Asians to celebrate girls' births and dismantle the patriarchy in the process. I am also the founder of South Asian Therapists, which is a collective of South Asian therapists around the world. So we offer people a directory that they can log into and find a South Asian therapist near them. Our work is to demystify therapy for South Asians, but to also help South Asians access culturally relevant and culturally sensitive therapy. Outside of that, I am a lawyer, and I don't really practice as a lawyer anymore. I work in startups, helping them scale and expand. But my passion is very much obviously within these community-based projects. So I'm here because of my affiliation with South Asian therapists. In terms of self-care, this is something I really struggle with. Like many of us, like many children of immigrants, I'm an anxious overachiever, and I do define my worth in terms of my productivity. So self-care is something I really struggle with. I can't say that there's much I do in terms of self-care, but the few things that I try and make sure I make time for are things like watching TV, listening to music, meditating/praying, and going to therapy when I feel I need it. I was diagnosed with depression when I was 13, and I medicate now. So there's a few things that I kind of have to do, but I really struggle with self-care. So I'm interested to know what other people will say about that one.
Fantastic, Raj, and thank you for bringing up such an important part of this. These concepts, these things will have really complex relationships with them, and this is exactly what this panel is hoping to unpack. Sometimes we use words, we use terms just for the sake of it, so it's really important for us to be able to think critically about them. So I appreciate that. Next, we'll ask Shah to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, it's great to see so many people join today. So yeah, my name's Shah. I am I don't know where to start. I don't want to go on for too long about me, but yeah, I'm Bangladeshi. I'm British. I'm from East London as well. So I guess my whole life has been spent in East London. I'm currently in East London as well. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I do a lot of work with the Bangladeshi community in my role. I work currently in pediatrics in Whitechapel in the Royal London Hospital, and it's actually where I was born. So it's very close to me. And I work with young people at the moment. And I think within my role and just a lot of what I'm doing is doing a lot of work with trying to think about removing some of the barriers to accessing mental health support for the South Asian community, but also trying to think about how we can support more South Asian people into roles such as therapists and psychologists, because at the moment it is a profession which is mainly a white female. So I think that there are very few South Asian therapists and psychologists, and even fewer men who are psychologists, for example. So that's part of the work that I'm doing. I've done for my thesis as well, for my research, I looking at the barriers to mental health support for minoritized communities. So I can maybe bring that in as well. Some of the research I did, and I did some research looking at exploring mental health in British Bangladeshi men as well. And just a bit about self-care. So I think in the past I wasn't great with self-care, but recently I think I've I've tried to get better at it, and I've gotten into a routine where on Saturday mornings I go for a run. So I did go for a run this morning, a very cold run in Victoria Park, which is just close to me, if anyone knows it. But it's a cold one, but the sun's out in London, so it was a nice one. So that's what I do, just listen to some music. I've been getting into some like old school Bollywood recently, during my runs, because I'm getting married in January. So I've been getting into music. But yeah, that's just a bit about me. So I think running and just listening to music is something that helps me, I think, switch off sometimes. But yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shah. And, I've been a long admirer of Shah's work. And ironically, this is the first time we've actually been in the same place in person like this. But it's been fantastic seeing kind of the work around mental health within Bengali Bangladeshi communities. And I really appreciate that you're taking the time out to spend with us today. Thank you, Shah. Nikhwat, what are we saying?
Well, firstly, I'm saying I'm also a fellow runner, so it's nice to be able to see someone else doing this also. More power to you. And I think cold runs are always the best one, but I'll get into that in a little bit. So, Assalamu alaikum, everybody, or peace be unto you. It's really nice to be in such a good space with everybody here. First and foremost, I just want to say massive congratulations to all of you who put this event together. I think it's such a wonderful initiative to be able to create this kind of space and have this kind of dialogue, because I know that I was always searching for this in I'm now in my late 20s, in my early 20s and early teens. I was always looking for this kind of environment, this kind of space. So to be able to have it, and to be able to be blessed to be able to speak in it is a real blessing. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So as Sharanjit said, my name is Nikhwat. I'm the co-director of an award-winning organization, or CIC, called The Delicate Mind. So The Delicate Mind began, I realize now actually it's been a long process and a long journey for me. So I'm someone who also lives with depression. I'm 28 now, and it took me, gosh goodness, 14 years to be able to compartmentalize and understand that this is the experience that I was living with. It was something that I didn't necessarily always know. I was aware of the emotions that I was feeling, but I wasn't necessarily aware that there was a terminology for the emotions and feelings that I was going through. And it took me a long time on my learning process, the learning journey, to realize that this is what I was living with. In a few years ago, 2017, my younger brother, God rest his soul, died as a consequence of suicide. And I had always been involved in mental health work, mental health campaigning. As you were saying earlier, it's about being an overachiever in one sense. And we're taught, and I think conditioned in one sense, to recognize that we exist within a Western country and we have to work harder than our counterparts. So I was always involved in different forms of activism, different forms of work. I didn't really have any clear set of purpose with what I was doing with it, but I'd always been involved in different sorts of things. And around about the time that Shahab passed away, I had an email in my inbox, and it always strikes me quite ironic. They're called the Faith and Belief Forum, a wonderful organization who I've got a long affiliation with. And there was a small amount of funding available to set up a workshop or to do something around the social action project. And I kept looking at this, I kept seeing this prior to what he passed away, and even afterwards thinking, something here, I really need and want to do something. This thing that's happened to me, and it's a trauma that I don't wish upon anybody. I don't want it to just be something that's happened to me. I need to give it some sense of purpose and direction. And so I kept looking at it, I didn't really know what to do. And then one day, it was after I spoke on the Beeb Station Network about South Asian mental health, and my best friend came to visit me. And he said, Nikhwat, I really need to talk to you about something. And I was like, okay, what is it? And he said, all of this work that you do with mental health, we should target it at Muslims. And I'm not sure I'm allowed to swear, so I won't. But I can tell you, I said a load of expletives, which were very excited. And there and then we wrote this application out together around what we were seeking to do, which was initially just focused on creating a safe space for Muslims. And it was going well. And then what happened was we started to create the event. As more and more people from different ethnic backgrounds and faith backgrounds wanted to come to the event. And we thought, okay, let's open up. And so we did. And we did one workshop, and by the grace of God, it went really well. We did a second workshop, and we were blessed with Sharanjit's presence. I was connected by one of my good allies and good friends. And he came to our second workshop, which went incredibly well. And we did a third one. And then from there, I felt a sense of purpose. I felt a sense of this is what I feel in my heart and my soul that I want to do. And it's been a long and continuous journey. And of course, I only have 5 minutes and I don't want to take too much time from anybody else. But from my heart to yours, I can say in sincerity that this is one of the reasons that I believe I've been put upon this earth. And the reason being is because now we work with all different racialized communities. So although our target focus is Muslims, we do different workshops and different things. So our main focus at the moment is we do workshops with different organizations. Through the grace of God, I've been blessed to work in prisons, youth clubs, faith institutions, public health bodies, the third sector, schools, community organizations, all things that have been monumental learning journeys for me and experiences that have taught me a lot about myself and a lot about the world. We do research. So we've recently been commissioned to do some research focused specifically on cannabis legalization and looking at how that will affect and benefit people's mental health, looking at socioeconomic reasons, economic reasons with the criminal justice system, because there's a lot disproportionately Black, Asian, ethnic minority people are criminalized as a consequence of the system. So that's something that we've been funded to do and something I'm really passionate about because I believe it's a good thing to do. So research is something we focus upon. We do training for different organizations, so things like equality and diversity. We've got one coming up with an organization called Suicide & Co. For that, we'll be supporting them who support people living free as a consequence of suicide. And then we also run mental health services. And the reason why I honestly, sincerely believe that this is why I've been put onto this earth, and this whole thing is quite bittersweet, is because I used to pray that this is what I want to do, this is what I want to happen for me, and by the grace of God, this is what's happened this year. So we were awarded funding by Public Health England to run a bereavement service for Muslims. So people who've experienced bereavements for the past few years will be running safe spaces for peer-to-peer support for self-identifying men, self-identifying women, and a general community support group for different people from different backgrounds to come together to effectively support each other. And with the second part of that session, we'll be looking at giving them things like cognitive behavioral therapy, neuroscience, but in a culturally competent way, ways that will go towards your audience. And we've also been funded by the Big Lottery Fund to run an anti-stigmatization project around mental health as well. But we'll be looking more at socioeconomic and racial inequality factors, because obviously stigma is very important, but the structure as it exists is one of the things that otherizes us as individuals and people and causes a lot of illnesses. The structures are both the problems and also the solutions. So for me, this whole process has been a lot to take in, a lot for me to reflect upon, very bittersweet, but it's something that I'm living, something that I'm doing. To be able to do it is a real blessing. I'm no longer the chubby stoner that I was living in my bedroom. I'm now doing things which are giving a sense of social purpose. For that, I'm truly, truly grateful. And once again, I'm truly grateful to be in this space with all of you. And I'm truly grateful for Sharanjit, South Asian Sisters, Desi Minds, and Expert by Experience, and anyone else that I've even started my hubris for setting up such a great space and relevant. Thank you so much for listening to me, and thank you so much for creating this space.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nikhwat, for sharing, your the history of how you've come to be who you are today. And I'm very grateful to have been connected with you and connected with all the panelists today, bringing everyone into this space. And last but not least, we're going to ask Ravita to quickly introduce herself, and then we're going to move and jump into the questions.
Hi everybody, it's really nice to see people joining the South Asian Festival, and it's nice to hear from all the panellists as well. My name is Ravita and I work freelance in the creative industries with a background in theatre, documentary filmmaking and research in creative academia. And I also run a page where I write about various issues called Raveeta Writes, and I talk a lot about caste, gender, race, and how that also intersects, but also some of the issues that we have specific to that, and LGBTQ plus identity as South Asians, but more so from a position of an ally, and how that affects mental health as well. So I'm interested in how all of these issues in terms of our identity as South Asians intersects, and that's what I write about, and that's also what I bring into my creative work too.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ravita. And I'm just going to hand it over to Mariam now to take us into the questions.
Quick thank you to all our panelists for their introductions and sharing that. Really appreciate it. So just to quickly dive in now into our panel and the conversation, what I'd really love to see if the panelists could share what their understanding of marginalization is as a word and as a concept before we dive even deeper into the panel. It's a word which is thrown around quite a lot these days, but what do the panelists, if just like in a quick, couple of sentences, understand with the word of marginalization itself? If I could start with Shah.
Yeah, so marginalization, I think what comes to my mind is, I think I would say just keywords like separation, thinking about power and thinking about difference and thinking about society and how different people are served or not served by society. So these are just initial things that come to mind. So not a sentence, but just certain words that come up for me.
That's absolutely fine. And Raj?
So for me, I think, so someone just asked, what does marginalization mean to you? Sorry, that was distracting me, Sharon. Yeah, I guess for me, it's a very similar answer to Shah, in that, all of my work has been around how certain groups of people feel excluded or are excluded from things. And that's kind of what it means to me. And I think the crux of all the work I do is around marginalization and trying to make space for more diverse voices in those arenas. Obviously, I have a lot of privileges that I bring to my work, and I'm not perfect at creating that space, but yeah, that's kind of what it means to me.
Ravita?
Yeah, I think just following off what Raj has said, essentially marginalization, I would say it's a feeling. It's that feeling of being othered. It's when people make you feel like you don't belong, and it's the kind of, I guess, emotions that then surface after having that experience. That is marginalization. I don't think you can always pinpoint that it's happening to you. That's the other thing about marginalization. You don't realize until you've walked away from a situation that actually that I was just othered. That was me experiencing a form of ism, and that was marginalization. And it's always something you process after it's happened. So essentially it's a feeling, and it's that journey of processing it and then what that makes you do afterwards. And I think for a lot of us, which is why we're doing this today, then we kind of go into, whether we go into activism or exploring that in our creative work, which is what I do, then we find different avenues to explore that processing of that emotion after.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And we're also seeing some really interesting answers in the chat as well. And Nikhwat, just to round that off.
I believe everybody said it so eloquently already, and it was also put within the chat as well. I think the only thing that I can really add is that I believe it's the otherization of the self. And by that, I mean that obviously, this conversation with my friend, the minute you come out of the womb, the minute you're born into this world, you are conditioned by things and factors outside of yourself. You're conditioned with your gender, you're conditioned with your sense of skin color, you're conditioned with your sense of religion. And I think that within the structures that you exist under, so whether that is the West, the South, the East, it doesn't necessarily really matter, because as a consequence of the structures that exist within those spaces and within those places, they will inform how other people experience you. And obviously, different people are disproportionately disadvantaged as a consequence of these structures and the consequence of these systems. So that's what I think marginalization means to me.
Thank you all for sharing that. And so I hope that gives good context and the different ways actually to think about marginalization for people listening in. And to take that a step further, then how do we feel this? Why is it important that we think about mental health and its relationship to marginalization? Because obviously this can be applied in so many avenues. How does it particularly then affect how people in the South Asian community might experience mental health or access mental health in all forms? So would love to hear that from the panelists as well. I'm now going to start with Raj.
So what's interesting is that a lot of these isms are also a form of marginalization, right? So racism is a way of excluding or othering people, same with sexism, casteism, able-bodyism, these kinds of things. And, for those of us who haven't seen it, there is now a large body of research that shows the correlation between racism and poor mental health outcomes. So in the simplest way, let's imagine that you are a Black man living in the UK. Obviously, there is a level of anxiety that accompanies your existence, right? Because you expect a certain amount of racism quite rationally as well. That's not an irrational expectation. And so the anxiety that comes from that marginalization and that discrimination, it sort of lays the foundation for mental health issues. So that's one side of it, how, you know, marginalization can create mental health issues. And that's a very simplistic explanation, but you can replace the Black man with a brown female or somebody of a, you know, a caste that is discriminated against, and you get the same sort of pattern, right? And then the other way in which marginalization works is that marginalization, much like racism, it's a comparison, right? It only exists if, like, you can only put someone down if you have another community that you're holding up. Like, it's a comparative sort of thing. So if you're marginalizing one group, that means that you're excluding them, but it also means that you are over including another group, right? So if you know, people of color are marginalized, we are excluded, and it means that the experiences and you know, the lives of white people are given perhaps more weight and credit than they deserve. And this plays out in a mental health perspective because, you know, mental health is not a one size fits all, and culture, language, upbringing all inform how mental health symptoms present. So, you know, there's a well-documented body of evidence now that shows that South Asians actually experience different mental health symptoms when they are depressed or anxious. But because the medical textbooks all sort of, you know, describe how a cis white man who is middle-aged experiences mental health, that's what we take to be as fact. And so everybody who's experiencing a symptom that might not fall into that very rigid category risks falling through the cracks, right? And this is something that is, you know, this happens on from a sex/gender perspective as well. Like, it's quite well documented that women experience ADHD differently to men, but because the textbooks kind of focus on the male, cis white male experience, women's symptoms get ignored. And we hear about this a lot now, that like, even, you know, women don't even experience heart attacks in the same way as men, yet we are all taught to, like, you know, look out for achy chest and achy arm, but women don't experience that. And so these are the ways in which, you know, marginalization affects people by creating mental health issues, but then also affects people by making their experience invisible and putting them at risk of falling through the cracks.
Thanks, Raj, and would love to give this opportunity to the other panelists to come in, perhaps with how they deal with marginalization in their profession or in their work with mental health.
I can go next if that's okay. I think with me, like, I've worked in the NHS for a really long time, and I think that there is a clear disparity within people like South Asian people and the numbers of the representation within mental health services. And I think that it shows how I think services sometimes describe the community as not engaging or hard to reach or not psychologically minded. And I think sometimes these terms can be used to almost label the community as a whole and just say, like, almost like we won't be able to reach them. But I think that there's a lot that services could do to actually reduce some of those barriers. And I think what's really important is doing outreach work and services going out into communities and working together with people, because I can just speak about my own community from my own experiences as well. Is I'm just thinking about like my parents as well, and like coming over to the UK, not being able to see like parents, family members who are still in Bangladesh, and how difficult that is, but also within families, just thinking about gender, for example, and I'm just drawing on the research that I did. I think some of the men I spoke to, the Bangladeshi men, spoke about some of the pressures of being a man in a family and the expectations of getting a job and supporting the family, and being like the breadwinner and the head of the household. And often if, say, for me, for example, I'm the only son in my family, and just thinking about how that pressure as well, that compared to maybe other communities or the maybe white majority population, there might be extra pressures that our community faces, the South Asian community faces, that not everyone would be aware of, which will then impact mental health. And then there are those socioeconomic factors around jobs, around finances as well, which then impact mental health, housing as well. So thinking about how society already isn't already sort of, it can feed into this marginalization that impacts mental health. But also, if some services don't have practitioners who speak different languages, or have or if people don't feel comfortable that mental health professionals can understand them or can support them, then there is that gap with accessing services. And I think that sometimes like NHS services might not be doing enough to actually reach out to communities and to support communities, which is, I think, a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment and thinking about of how to improve services for people. Because I see it just from my experience. If I work with kids, but I have a lot of parents who don't speak English, and just when I call up a parent and just speak Bengali with them, and how sort of how much of a relief that is, that they're able to speak to someone in their mother tongue. And I think that that is something that is needed a lot more within services. But I'll end it there for me for now.
That's really interesting. Thank you both, Raj and Shah, for sharing that. And I think it's, you know, it's fascinating of like how your own identity of like being marginalized, you know, as Raj, you mentioned, whether you're a Black man or a brown woman, or, you know, whether you're the child of someone who can't speak the language, how these can all, and these are wider things than just the South Asian community. And so I wanted to bring in Ravita into this conversation as well, from the perspective of caste, actually, because this feels something which might be a bit more specific to our community. And so Ravita, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the effects of marginalization, specifically on caste as well, and mental health.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think when I first started this research a few years ago, looking at caste, my work specifically started by looking at caste in the diaspora. And I didn't really focus on mental health as much. I was just sort of trying to look into whether this was an issue and if we were willing to have that conversation. And I realized there was a lot of denial around it. Then I started to face a lot of resistance, really aggressive resistance for purely engaging in academic research, which I found really bizarre. I couldn't understand that. And then I started to think about how, like, this is my experience as a researcher, and I'm finding this like mentally draining. How would this affect people who are experiencing caste discrimination? What does it do to their mental health? Who can they access, or what sort of resources are available to people when it comes to these kind of challenges? Because I started to receive really shocking emails once people kind of started to realize that, you know, they could have that conversation with me through my page, and they started to build that trust. Then I started to look into mental health, and I realized it's not even a conversation for us. There isn't much research into this, particularly in the diaspora. And when I started to talk to mental health professionals, they would just say, you know, there was one who said to me, in my 10 years of being a clinical psychologist, I've not really come across this as an issue. And I thought, well, that within itself is an issue, because I know from my work that this is affecting young people, and it's affecting young people more than I thought it was. So there's clearly a barrier there. And that within itself was quite, for me personally, I found that quite sad. I just thought that there are young people who are struggling. They're in relationships, they're struggling to stay in those relationships because of caste, or somebody's abandoned them after years of being together because you're not good enough because of your caste. All of a sudden you've had this epiphany. Who do they talk to? They can't necessarily talk to their family members because their family members are against this relationship. They may have friends who are of the same opinion. So who do they talk to? And that was one of the reasons why I then took my research to social media, even though I knew and became quite vocal, even though I knew there was resistance and I didn't quite know how aggressive that resistance would get. I just thought, no, that we need to have this conversation because this is a problem. Now, a few years on, you know, we're seeing the online conversations growing. We're seeing people entering that discussion. Like Raj has stepped forward and she's kind of been supportive. She's talked about caste on the Pink Laddu platform. And she's actually, I follow quite a few South Asian mental health pages, and I've only seen the South Asian therapist page address caste. I haven't seen any of the other pages address caste, and I found that quite telling. Maybe people don't know how to navigate that conversation. Maybe people don't want to rock the boat. Maybe there's a lot of us that think this isn't an issue because we want to believe that it's not. So in order for us to get to the discussion about marginalisation and caste, we first need to accept that this is an issue, and we haven't quite done that yet across the board as South Asians. That's where we're at with this.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ravita, not only for platforming and amplifying caste in this conversation, but outlining that, you know, we even need to have the basic awareness of how caste even operates in our communities before thinking about, you know, how it affects mental health. Really appreciate that. And in this conversation, I want to bring Nikhwat in because I know you mentioned, you know, work that you do within the criminal justice system. And I think, you know, when we're thinking about marginalization and mental health, I think oftentimes we will forget those who are, you know, being held captive or incarcerated. And so I want to hear a bit about what you've seen and what you've experienced doing that work and how we can learn from it here today, because I know I've had family members who've been interacting with the criminal justice system, and it's something that sometimes we push away in our families or our communities. But you know, it's so important to recenter those folks in this conversation as well.
I completely agree. And if you'll oblige me, I'll tell you a story as to why I think this whole process continues to be quite transformative. So first and foremost, my point is that I think there needs to be a complete reformation of the criminal justice system and also policing within this country, which will probably get me into trouble for saying so, but it's something that I sincerely believe. I don't think that every individual within the institution, in fact, I know from personal and first-hand experience, those people who are in those institutions are necessarily bad people. But what happens is when you're part of any institution, you will become institutionalized, regardless of whatever that is. And being consciously aware of it is something that is very difficult to always do, especially when you're amidst of it. I think this is something that I had a conversation with another one of my friends about, how the system that we exist under, which is capitalism, is something that a lot of people ingrained within their own sense of self, their own sense of purpose. It was something that was, for me, seen during the basis of lockdown, when people felt that I had to work from home or I'd lost my sense of my job, and they lost that sense of direction because you have something to give yourself towards. But that's another conversation for another time. In relation to the criminal justice system, so the story I will share with you is I have worked in a prison which is called HMP Staffordshire, and I will give a trigger warning just in case anyone feels uncomfortable, but I am going to touch upon things around sexual violence. So please, obviously, if this is something which is triggering for you, I want to give you ample time to step away as of now. So this prison is a prison that specifically works with sex offenders. And if you know me in any personal capacity, you will have heard the things I've said about these kinds of crimes and these kinds of people, things that you would read in the Daily Mail comments, to be completely sincerely honest with you. And I was given an experience and an opportunity to go into this prison and to go through the prison walls, to actually see the system as it functions. And we took it. Initially, I struggled to think about, is this something that I want to do? Do I want to be in this kind of space? And I said, okay, this has been put onto my table. Let me see where this will take me. And I remember very vividly going through the prison, meeting the inmates. And the funny thing is, again, we talk about, as I mentioned, institutionalization. The staff would call them residents, whereas the inmates would call themselves prisoners. And already you would see that dichotomy between both of them. Anyway, as I was going through, I remember asking one of the staff members, could you lock me into one of the cells? Because it's exciting. It's something different that not really good to do. So she did. She put me in the cell, shut the door, and I just remember the stench of the room. And I remember looking around it and thinking, these are the conditions in which we put people under and into. And of course, the basis of the crime in which they're there for is abhorrent. And I'm not going to make any excuses for it. But something happened during that time whereby we had a table laid out. So we agreed to do some work with them about rehabilitation. The way that I suppose mentally justified it is I thought, I'm here to do work on rehabilitation. There will be a point in which these people will be released into society, and how they're treated within those institutions affects us as a wider populace and as wider people. So I thought it was somewhat pertinent and somewhat important. So I know the basis of why they were there, but I didn't know specifically each individual case. And by doing so, I felt I was able to meet them as a human being, as a person. So one guy came and sat down at our table, and this is a prison specifically, mostly which is majority Caucasian, and mostly these people are between the ages of 40 to 60 years old. And he was a mixed race man, and he was 21 years old, and he sat down at our table, and we had 3 words laid out. We had the word faith, masculinity, and identity. The reason that they were there is because one thing that we try to do for the delicate mind is get people to understand the sense of self, to understand how much we've been conditioned by other people's experiences and opinions of who we are, and how much of that is self-stigmatization. And those 3 terms, especially through our experience, through our work, have been quite pertinent within the South Asian diaspora, the South Asian community. So he sat down at our table, and he was being a bit of a lad in that sense. And it's okay. I'm a social chameleon. I can match the energy if I need to. And when we did, we were joking, we were laughing. And then he started opening up a little bit to me about his life experiences and what happened to him. And he told me his story about how when he was 14 years old, he was involved in crime, and he and his best friend were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. And what happened was, this one night, his best friend and him were shot. And his best friend lay in his arms dying, and he saw this happen to him. And I remember very vividly having a really out-of-body experience, thinking I've been so quick to categorize this person and these people as evil, and they act as evil, absolutely. What are the conditions that bring you to these places? What are the factors that bring you to that sort of environment? And I really struggled with that for many, many months, actually. My ex-partner, God bless her, was just listening to me go on and on and on about it, because for so long I'd been so sure about what I'd said about these people. And to have that taken apart is a good thing. It's a good basis of the journey of understanding more about the system, as how it functions and how it exists. So I think what is important about the criminal justice system is thinking about what is it that has brought these people. Their personal responsibility is very important. All of us are capable and conscious human beings who are able to make our own choices and our own decisions. But we almost look at the lottery of life. We also have to look at the hands that we've been dealt. Even here today, I'm sure there's people within our diaspora who have certain, I suppose, privileges above others, and that's just going to happen. As the roll of the dice, the lottery of life, whatever it is you want to call it, because there's different terms. The point is, all of us will be in different positions. So I think what is fundamentally important, especially when we talk about mental health, as I said earlier, the structures are both the solutions and the structures are both the problems as well. So I believe that it's quite sincere and quite necessary. My background is in law, and just like yourself, I don't practice. I don't really like lawyers, but that's the conversation. What I think is quite important is about looking at what are the structures and inequalities that exist that perpetuate crime, that perpetuate inequality, and perpetuate mental health injustice. And if we look around us, we see a lot of what happens. We see and we feel it in our bones. And I think that is why so many of us have existed and create the work that we do now, because we recognize the inequalities that we have experienced and we've seen others people have experienced as well. So I believe that system change, in the sense of what we can do as a community, is very, very, very important. I don't have all the solutions, and we're still in the bits of figuring everything out. But to be in a space where I can advocate for things that I sincerely believe in is, as I said, a humongous blessing. I'm not quite sure I answered the question, but I think I gave you guys hopefully an interesting story to reflect on. So once again, thank you for listening to it.
Much appreciated, Nikhwat, and I really appreciate you sharing your experiences of support in this space as well. I had a particular importance of bringing this to the fore because I think this is a topic that we need to consider alongside all the other marginalizations we're going to be discussing today as well. And as Nikhwat was talking about, these very literal institutional barriers within his context, it got me thinking a lot about some of the other institutional barriers that we may have noticed. And Raj, it got me thinking about South Asian therapists and what the drive was for creating that type of platform, that type of resource. And thinking about what kind of blocks, what kind of systemic gaps really fed into that. And I'd love to hear a bit about you from that.
So I will try and give you the shortest overview of how we sort of got to South Asian therapists, but for context, So like I said before, I got diagnosed with depression when I was 13, and I grew up in North America. So I've had the benefit of being in a very pro-therapy atmosphere. We had counselors and therapists at school, like elementary school. So I've been in and out of therapy my entire life. So for me, it wasn't anything new, but I know that when I moved back to the UK, the English attitude towards therapy is very, very different. It's just a completely different experience. So over the years, there've been a lot of mates of mine, South Asian, who I'm that person that will always say, you should go to therapy. And a lot of them actually would say like, yeah, I wanted to go, but like I couldn't find an Asian therapist. And that was a surprise to me because I've actually never had an Asian therapist. And I was just like, oh, like, tell me more about that. Anyway, fast forward to 2020, we had the pandemic, and I was sharing a series of posts on Pink Laddu about being brown and locked down, how, the pandemic is hilarious for white people, but for brown girls, like we've basically been locked up our entire lives. So this is like really triggering and also nothing different for us. And I started getting a lot of very seriously traumatic messages. And I thought, I'm going to put together a resource of South Asian therapists that I can point Pink Laddu followers to. So I put a call out. And I thought I would get like 30 or 40 responses. I would just share them in an Excel sheet. But in 4 days, over 500 South Asian therapists replied. And then I thought, okay, in order to be valuable, this needs to be like searchable by geolocation, on specialty, languages, etc., etc. And we've now gotten to the point where this is a full-fledged directory. Now, the interesting thing is, I had never examined why or how a South Asian therapist might be beneficial. But through doing South Asian therapists and through having people tell me that they only wanted to talk to a South Asian therapist and listing the reasons why, it really made me think about my own experiences in therapy. And as I sat down and was really peeling back the layers, firstly, I have spent inordinate amounts of time explaining South Asian culture or South Asian values or customs or traditions to my white therapists. So I'm literally paying them to educate them about my experience so that they can better treat me or understand me. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that there's an inherent power imbalance and power relationship, right, within the therapist and client or patient dynamic. And there are certain things that I now look back on and I'm like, that was weird. So for example, me explaining to a white therapist that I call somebody auntie who isn't actually my auntie, why is that such a difficult thing for her to understand? Like, this person can understand really complicated biological concepts and like psychological concepts, yet me, a brown woman, saying that I call somebody auntie who isn't my auntie is like mind-boggling. It's just too much for her to get her head around. And that, a white therapist treating that as a complicated concept is rooted in white supremacy. It's rooted in othering. And I'm not saying that my psychologist or my therapist was being consciously discriminatory in that instance, but we are all a product of our upbringing and our conditioning and our environment. And so othering me in that way, in that dynamic, is not helpful. And it kind of creates this power imbalance in the therapy session that I just never had thought about. I mean, I arrived at therapy very early. I was only 13. And so I kind of took what I was given by the system. I wasn't old enough to maybe think about my preferences or what I wanted. But now that I've been doing South Asian therapists, I've got to say, like, it's been a real learning curve for me. And, I'm back in therapy now. And, my partner and I went into couples therapy this year. And I've got to say, like, my therapists are Asian now. So for me, it's been quite an interesting journey as somebody who's been very pro-therapy my whole life. But also I had blind spots that I didn't even realize. And it took the community engaging with me in that way for me to see what the gaps were.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raj. And, a lot of folks are relating in the chat as well. And so, I think it's always concerning, but always uplifting to recognize that the work we're trying to do are speaking to the chavlenges experienced by folks out there as well. Shah, for me, what Raj has been mentioning, about the importance of having an option to speak to a South Asian therapist, someone who could connect with your background, I'd really just love to bring you in around what impact has that made, in situations you found yourself in? Is it something that really can transform someone's experiences? And yeah, I'd love to hear from that, because as you're a practitioner.
Yeah, I think I've just seen how powerful it is that I think because I currently work with young people, for parents, but also for the teenagers that I work with as well. A young girl I worked with recently, because I joined this service recently, she said to me, I asked her how is it seeing a male therapist, but she was Bangladeshi as well, and someone from the same community, and she said, um, it's easier because you get it, speaking to someone who gets it. And I think that it just, because I'm in this position now, and I think that I'm really grateful to have had the opportunities that I've had to get to this position I am now, to be a psychologist and have a certain platform and a certain position. I'm thinking about what can I do with that platform now to better serve the community and better to support the community as well. And I think just bringing it back to the research I did, I think that it's important that people have the option if they would like to speak to someone or South Asian therapist, or if they would like to speak to someone from a different background. Because I see on the other side of it that some people may not want to speak to someone from the same community because of reasons around confidentiality, which was, when I did my research, I was thinking about this, that would the Bangladeshi men want to speak to me because I'm Bangladeshi as well, and there might be concerns about, I might know like their family members or their friends, and that's something that I was concerned about. But actually there were 12 men that I spoke to. Their age ranged from about 22 up to 59. And they all said that it was actually better to speak to me, that speak to someone from their own community, and actually have someone who they could visibly see was a South Asian psychologist, that they could see that because they hadn't really seen that before, and a man as well who they were able to speak to. And that's someone who did reach out to them, and that's someone who did give that space for them to talk about their views around mental health. And for some of them, it was something they had never spoken about before. So I think I really appreciated hearing their stories and them being able to trust me with that. So I've just seen how powerful it is to have, even just to see someone like who is the same color as you, and how powerful that is. And I think coming into that, because I'm Muslim, and I think thinking about religion as well, and how there are so many strengths in the Muslim patients that I work with that often white therapists miss, seeing how going to the mosque, doing prayer, that's so powerful for people, not to say for everyone, but for people who do link very much and feel like religion is very close to them, that is such a source of comfort and peace. But sometimes therapists miss that and miss the strengths of our community as well, and not just see the community as like a community that doesn't have any strengths, or just seeing that sometimes those strengths that we have can be missed, and it's important to recognize and to celebrate those strengths that we have and the resources that we have, which sometimes aren't thought about so much.
I really appreciate, just very quickly, I know Mariam's going to come in with a question, really appreciated you bringing up that conversation about strengths as well, Shah, because there are things that work, there are things that need improving, but the only way we're going to work towards solutions is to understand and see how both are functioning. So really appreciate that. I'm just going to hand it over to Mariam for the next question.
No worries. And Ravita, like, speaking of different strengths that we can have, and sometimes therapy and actually going straight to professional counseling might not be the only, some people might not have the confidence to approach that, and is also not the only way to help your mental health. So how has that informed your experiences in working in this area?
I think if I was to focus specifically on caste, to be honest, if you really want me to be honest, I haven't seen strengths in our community to deal with this. We haven't built the foundation. We don't have the foundation. So where is the strength going to come from? And I know it might sound disheartening for some people, and others, will disagree with that, but it's the truth. And I've consistently seen it. I mean, just last week, I was going through some of the emails I've had come through my blog, Ravita Writes, and there are girls who are from dominant castes that, you know, they're studying, they're at university, they're in long-term relationships, they want to be with their partners. And instead of feeling like they can reach out to a South Asian therapist, they have reached out to me, somebody who's been researching, writing about caste alongside some other issues. And they're sharing their story with me because they don't feel like they have an outlet. So that to me tells me consistently, and has done over the years, that we don't have any strengths as a community. You might find that strength in one friend who is understanding, or, you know, somebody that you might speak to, or a platform that you might follow on social media that influences the way you think, or might help you get through the day. If you know, sometimes you can see that one post online and it can make you think about whatever you're going through. But outside of that, I'm yet to see us really build those kind of strong, I mean, I don't even know what you would call it. We haven't got a foundation. So where do we start? We need to build the foundation, and that is taking a lot of work, even in this day and age.
So off the back of that, then, what do you think, with these two sort of lines of work that's going on, you know, creating more diverse sort of access to therapy, having, you know, a South therapist where also having these other platforms, of the sort of creative work that you're doing, the way you're sort of connecting with people in the community, how do you think we can complement these together to then start building that bridge towards a more united front in dealing with mental health in all its forms and in all the people who are marginalized with that? It seems, you know, there's a lot from the conversation we've had so far, you know, there's a lot that is progressing and there's a lot that we've achieved, but there's also a long way to go. So how do you think we can complement the different ways that we're dealing with this?
I think one of the first things we need to do, we're kind of doing this today actually, is having open conversations within the community and listening to one another, and understanding that just because we're South Asian doesn't mean we're all going to have the same experiences. We come from different ethnicities, we speak different languages, we're of different faiths, and we are of different castes. And sometimes that is an issue for you and sometimes it's not. You know, like I didn't face the resistance that I have been facing with the work that I've done until I started publicly talking about caste, because all of a sudden my surname became like this red siren to people, and they started to place their prejudices and stereotypes as to why I was doing this research. And for me, it was just an area of interest, and I thought I was going to get a lot more support from the community because I thought we were in a better position, but clearly, you know, I was proved wrong. And that can also be reflective of the people we gravitate towards. We tend to gravitate towards like-minded individuals, people who have shared interest and shared politics, shared views. And then that's also reflected when you look at some of these conversations that are being, you know, that are taking place on social media, whether it's the homophobic commentary that you see online in our communities, and that's been appalling. I've seen quite a lot of that. Whether it's people making casually racist or casually caste discriminatory remarks and not really reflecting, and you see all their friends jumping in. And then what happens is those of us who take social media more critically, more seriously, we come in with an interventionist perspective, and we're like, okay, these are the discussions that are going viral on social media, but here's an alternative perspective to that. So social media is helping, it is assisting in kind of acting as an interventionist voice, but it is going to take a community effort, and that is going to take time. And the other thing with South Asian therapy in relation, if we look at caste, is sometimes you're going to have somebody who might be dealing with, you know, their identity as somebody who identifies as being LGBTQ plus and doesn't come from a dominant caste, or is identified, you know, with being queer, that these are identities that people have of themselves. So you're going to go into the room with all those kind of issues going on. You might be dealing with issues around race as well. So that there's some complexities around that. And then the South Asian therapist is also coming into that room with you, with their prejudices, with their discriminations, with whatever they've been raised with. So that's going to be a challenge within itself. If you are somebody who believes caste isn't an issue and you work within the mental health sector, and then you're having to support somebody who is going through an experience, how are you going to deal with that as a therapist? And that is a challenge for people who are of South Asian backgrounds, who want to go and have those conversations. I've had quite a few Pakistani Muslim women reach out to me as well and say, we can't have this conversation because it's always, well, caste isn't even an issue. And, you know, I find with Muslims and Sikhs, we do this a lot. We try to deflect and we try to use religion to hide behind that. But it's like, and for me, with the way I'm doing my work, I'm a bit like, no, love, it's an issue. Have the conversation. People are suffering because of it. It's massively hypocritical for us to talk about, you know, whiteness and white privilege and then be completely dismissive of people's identities when it comes to caste and how that also intersects with gender and our sexual identity. So in order for us to open all of those different avenues for discussion, we've got to have these kind of conversations that are taking place today.
Can I add something to that as well? I mean, I feel like everybody here, if you don't follow Ravita, you must. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to reflect on caste. It's exactly what she said about going into this kind of work, hopeful that your community is willing to change. And I had a discussion with a non-Asian, a white person recently who was like trying to show me how, you know, how much they love D&I. And they were basically just saying that, like, yeah, I always say to people, like, why can't, you know, minorities have a seat at the table? Like, you don't have to give up your seat at the table to give someone else a seat at the table. And I was like, actually, this is where you're wrong. You do have to give up your seat at the table. Power is finite. Power is a finite pie. And this is why people hog it, right? If you could give me a seat at the table without losing your seat at the table, then you would just do it. But because power is finite, people don't want to give it up. And this goes with race and, you know, sex and caste. Is when has anybody in history given up their power without a fight, right? Nobody wants to lose the privileges and the benefits they receive from, you know, this kind of power imbalance. And I think when you realize that about your own community, that we are ourselves so invested in this power imbalance, you kind of realize that this is where the reluctance comes from to deal with and tackle these issues. And I think, yeah, I don't know how Raveeta does it. I swear, I posted on this like twice, and the amount of abuse I got in the 6 years I've been on social media, I've never received as much abuse as I got for talking about caste. And I think it's one of the hidden ills that we all need to grapple with, really.
Yeah, I just want to come in as well with what Raj was saying there, because it was disturbing and interesting to observe, because those of us who have been engaging with the work on caste, there's a lot of dynamics that you see, kind of those discussions taking place online and those dynamics playing out online that we're already conscious of as people who've been researching, looking at caste and gender. And when I saw the way people interacted with Raj, where she had people who were supportive, but also really aggressive resistance against the conversations she was having, it had a lot to do with the fact that they were looking at her surname and associating that with a dominant caste and saying, and it was essentially, how can a woman from this dominant caste community be talking against it? Because caste it's maintained through women. It's maintained and upheld through patriarchy, which is why we want to condition people to marry within their own community, their own caste community. We have this really flawed understanding of caste as well, where we think it's a division based on occupation, and it's not. That's a myth. It really isn't. When you look into the history of it, different caste communities have been landowners, they have been in various occupations. Caste is a division of people and labor, and the way that hierarchy works is, if you keep all of these different caste communities infighting, the people on the top never have to do anything about it. And the best way to uphold that hierarchy is to put the pressure on the women. And it's to say to the women, you must marry within caste, or is something wrong with you? Like, how can you be challenging this community, your own community? How could you be going against it? It's like this sense of betrayal. And the root of that always essentially comes down to the denial that we have, where we really don't want to let go of that power when it comes to our caste, or whatever we associate with being of a dominant caste, but also re-educating ourselves to a lot of the atrocities that have been committed, you know, in India, in Pakistan, in Nepal. They're horrific, they're shocking. You know, I had to take time away from my research because I was so disturbed by the things that I was reading and the videos that were being sent to me by other activists that I had connected with in the subcontinent. And the fact that we as a diaspora are willing to look the other way when we talk about caste it speaks to a lot of the dynamics that we have at play when it comes to power and patriarchy. Caste has been upheld because of the patriarchy.
Thank you both. That's really, really incredible insight from both of you, and really powerful. And I want to open that up a bit as well. So, we're hearing about how, I think Ravita, you just said how women can, are part of upholding caste. So how do we navigate the conversation from focusing on a single category of difference? So, gender is often, how women experience, and race is, their gender and race specifically, I think, are quite often used as like the category of difference, but it's so much more complex than that. So, and this is to the whole panel, how do we navigate this conversation from focusing away from a single category and to actually appreciate the multiplicity of people's identities when we're dealing with these issues and have these conversations?
I think one of the main things is to understand that we're not one identity. We're not just our race. We're not just our gender. We're not just our sexuality. It's an aspect of who we are. Identity is layered, and that is what can be very enriching. And it's good to celebrate the fact that we come from, these complexities and these layers. They make us who we are, and to understand that they intersect. And that's why when I do the work that I do, and I talk about, the issues I talk about, I make sure that I focus on things like race, gender, caste, and mental health, because they all intersect. We can't talk about everything when we talk about identity. We do need to narrow those conversations down in order for us to have constructive discussions, and discussions that are going to benefit us. But when we do that, we also need to remember this is layered. So if you're talking to a male about his dominant caste experience, and you're talking to a female who doesn't come from a dominant caste, she comes from a caste that's considered Dalit or oppressed or low caste, there's going to be two very different perspectives taking place in that conversation. You may also have, we also need to remember that caste is a state of mind. It's something people carry with them in their minds. It's an attitude, it's a mental attitude, and it's a very negative mental attitude. Just like when we have discriminatory attitudes towards somebody based on their sexuality. There was a conversation that took place on social media, on Twitter, and it went viral. And it was really horrific because you saw a bunch of heterosexual dominant caste people on social media attacking in really violent ways. I'm sure Sharanjit saw this as well. Somebody who wasn't from a dominant caste, and they were making memes using their photograph from their Twitter bio. And it was homophobic and caste discriminatory, and it was disgusting. And it made its way to Instagram. And then I saw, it's not just happened to one. I've seen this happening to a few people on social media. And then this was another reason why I was like, okay, we really need to actually, those of us who care about various isms and allyship, we really need to start to bring our voices to the queer community or the LGBTQ plus community, and deal with those challenges and those discriminations that exist within our own homes, within our friend circles, within our communities. So you see a lot of this playing out on social media, and interestingly, it makes you reflect because it's in writing. But also, I think we need to remember when that's happening in front of us in passing conversation, that's also when we really need to challenge that too.
Thanks, Ravita. And Shah, I'd like to bring you into the fold now of, how we've kind of touched upon previously how, just having kind of South Asian therapists and like, yourself being a Bengali man, how that, has the impact of the people who are able to talk to you in a way that they wouldn't be able to other therapists. But then, with this conversation now, we're going, a layer even deeper than that, where like we have, a South Asian community, but it's not homogenous. So what do you think the challenges might be for kind of South Asian therapists to deal with these different marginalizations within the community? And how, do you think, as we can approach that?
Yeah, thanks, Mariam. I think it's really important. I think Ravita said this about how, I think Raj might have said this as well, of how even though, like, I'll give myself an example. Say if I'm working with someone who is Bangladeshi and a man, remembering that everyone is different, and then there are those other aspects of identity. There's like religion, but it's not to say that because someone grew up as following a particular religion, they might not identify or follow it when they're as adults, or thinking about sexuality as well. And there are those other aspects of identity which is important to explore. So I'm just thinking about myself as a therapist, that I have my own sort of biases and assumptions that I might have myself, but being able to try and be aware of those. And I have my own therapy as well, and have that have a space to sort of talk about maybe things that I've noticed in myself. So I think therapists, and just because you have a South Asian therapist, remembering, I think this was mentioned earlier, that there are those differences as well as similarities, and each person is an individual and they'll have their own experiences. So it's important to really hear what those experiences are for each person. And I think I make sure I try this as much as possible, is, yeah, just because I hear that, oh, this client is Bangladeshi, that I don't assume that I'm going to completely know everything that's going on for them. That it's still important to take time to hear from each person. Because I know, like in my, I think, I know that, like in my community, that there are views around the LGBT community, and I know that myself, I don't maybe follow certain views that maybe extended family members hold, and I do bring up those conversations and question them about maybe some of the views that they hold. But I think as a therapist, it's important for me to hold that stance of being open and hearing from each person, and being as non-judgmental as I can, but again, noticing maybe growing up the messages that I've had and received growing up in a family, in a community, and how that maybe impacts how I experience the world myself and how I see things as well. So I think that's not easy, it's a difficult thing, but just, I think, noticing, someone said this earlier, that we are shaped by our early experiences and our environments and the family and friends and the people around us. So I think it's important just to be aware of, maybe I think for myself, the biases that I might hold, but each person that I work with, remembering that they're an individual, and it's a privilege for me to hear those experiences and for them to open up, because just someone sitting in front of me and actually speaking about this, there's so many more barriers before they get to that point, and just remembering that as well, that is as well as a big step that someone has made. Yeah.
Cool, thank you, Shah. Yeah, it's, the conversation is so layered with the number of challenges at each step that we go to. And it's, going from the outside in, and we can see there's just so many different angles at every point. And that's why it's so important for us to have these conversations with, panelists from different backgrounds. And I really hope, and from the chat, I can see how much the attendees are appreciating this. And just to pivot slightly from the conversation, but still on, the different ways to approach mental health, and kind of the domination of a lot of Western literature and research on mental health. And there's a lot of talk, especially I think, that you see now about setting boundaries, for instance, and how that can be difficult in South Asian communities, where our communities are a lot more, community based and less individualistic based, which is sometimes more applicable to Western therapy and the way those societies are more arranged. And even though we're living here, or many people here are living in Western societies, not just the UK, it's having that approach which can be not as applicable. So how do we, I was wondering what the thoughts are, and I know, Raj, this is something that you've spoken of before as well, of the different approaches to boundary setting, and how do we kind of overcome that, and in a way which actually is, more helpful for our communities.
So please forgive if I use any language that isn't appropriate in this context. I'm trying my best to articulate this point, but something I see a lot, and these posts that go viral online are always like, man, Desi people need to enter therapy, because I was telling my therapist about my toxic brother and she said, you need to cut him off. And hey, white therapist, why don't you get it? I can't just do that. And like, we all laugh because like A, I can't cut off my brother, sort of, and B, this is the classic tension between like, you know, we've all been raised with that idea of like white people just ditch their families and we're not like them, right? Now, the thing that's interesting is that, yes, a South Asian person with a toxic brother should probably cut that brother off at some point. But the reason why it's a problem when it's said in the context of this white therapist delivering that advice is A, they're a white person saying this. So the South Asian patient is already arriving at this thinking that the white therapist is a bit flippant with family relationships. That's the first thing. Secondly, what I think sometimes white therapists don't understand is that there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid before a South Asian person can get to a point where they excommunicate their family. You have to be willing to realize that South Asians are often raised with like 20 or 30 years of conditioning that they should worship their family no matter what. We are willing to accept that we might need to excommunicate certain family members, but that it's not going to happen overnight. And I think a white therapist launching into that conversation instantly with cut your mom off or cut your dad off or cut your brother off, it doesn't do any of the groundwork to like actually unpack the 20 years of conditioning where we are taught to worship that person no matter what. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's a lot of talk online about like, when you set a boundary, don't explain yourself. You just set that boundary and you just let that boundary be. I mean, that might work for like Jane, who is telling her mom, like, hey, mom, don't ask me about my school day. I don't want to talk about this. Most of us would get a backhander at home if we spoke to our mom like that, right? So again, it's the same idea that like we are not all arriving at boundaries with the same level of acceptance from others. So for Bobby, it might be okay to say to his mom, don't question me about that. But for Preeti, she might have to say, mom, like when you ask me that question, it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable and it makes me anxious, AKA explain herself. That doesn't mean that like Preeti is selling herself out or selling the boundaries community out. It just means that like Preeti's in a different situation. And whilst the ideal situation might be that you create a boundary and you never explain yourself, that's actually not safe for South Asians all the time. They might create a really tense or actively unsafe atmosphere at home by being so aggressive with these boundaries. So sometimes I think the quite binary black and white views that we see online don't actually apply to South Asians. And I get boundaries all the time. Boundaries is the biggest question we're asked. My advice is always start slowly, explain yourself if you have to, get to a point where you can be quite final about it. But yeah, it's I think that's how I see it play out in the boundaries context. Sorry, I've taken up a lot of time here, but I'll pass the mic now.
No, that's absolutely fine. And Nikhwat, I was wondering your kind of view on this, and especially from, you know, you starting from with a focus on the Muslim community and how maybe that conversation of boundaries plays out when it comes to religion, whether religion in general or like specifically Muslims.
Could you ask me the question again, please? Because I'm not quite sure I understood.
That's completely fine. So in terms of the conversation about boundaries and how often that's like a Western perspective of draw a boundary, and you know how that might apply, that conversation might apply to someone who's being asked to put a boundary when it comes to their religious views, and how that's far more complicated, that binary outlook and that black and white view of just set a boundary with something as complex as the things that Raj was talking about, but also like then you have that added field of religion there as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think there's a couple of things to consider about this. I think, as everybody's touched on today, we have to understand the totality of the self. And by that, I mean, we have to look at our own class, race, gender, sexuality, disability as well. These things are quite often not necessarily platformed or understood in the way in which I think that they should be, and given the respect that they should be as well. I think that's very important to understand that. For example, me as an able-bodied cis straight male from the Muslim community, I have a lot more privileges which I'm consciously aware of and I consciously see that a lot of my sisters don't, a lot of my LGBT brethren don't as well, specifically a lot of my LGBT brethren. And I say that because, or LGBTQIA brethren, and I say that because unfortunately within my family, within other persons and other people, I have seen how this plays out. It's much harder, as Raj was saying, to set a boundary in these contexts, within these environments, because we are raised differently. We've always been raised differently. But we have to consider that our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, these people come from the South, and they experience the world differently. They have a different form and different sort of manner in which they grow up families. It's not the Western nuclear family. It's very, very different in the way in which we're born. Everybody knows everybody's business. And to take that model and bring it over here within the West, I think it is very difficult to be able to compartmentalize that. I say that because as someone who is Muslim and has been born in the West, some of my things I love the most are from this country. I love rock and roll, I love music, I love breeding, I love all of these things, and they're so rooted within the West. But then equally, I love my culture, I love my faith, I love my language, and these things are really important parts of my identity. And of course, it is much harder to be able to compartmentalize this within this kind of country. I feel, for me, and perhaps some people relate to this, I feel too, even when I return to the South, when I go to Pakistan, I speak the language very well, I know the history very well, I still feel too Western, too Gordon, I carry myself differently. When I'm here, I'm still too much of a, forgive me for using this word, too much of a packy for some people as well. It doesn't matter how many people try and call me Nick, or how many pubs I've tried to or will try and sit in, that's not part of my identity. And to be able to sort of compartmentalize that is really difficult. It's a very, very, very hard process. And I'm not sure that I have fundamentally what is the solution, because I know there are certain situations where it doesn't play out well, and that's really unfortunate. When it comes to setting boundaries, however, especially in the context of the Muslim diaspora, or people that I know, again, it's not easy, because sometimes your conditions may be, I am in this home, I have to live within this environment, and leaving here will literally lead to being homeless. For example, LGBT plus people are, I think, 50% more likely to become homeless as a consequence of it. I'm not quite sure of the statistics and the data around LGBTQI plus Muslims, but I am very sure from my personal experience, my dealings with people and the work in which I do, that it's much, much higher. It's much, much, much harder from someone who is from a Muslim diaspora and who is, for example, a woman, and who is, for example, someone who sits outside of the boundary, to be able to say, Mom, Dad, I'm someone who is not heterosexual. To be able to do that brings a lot of shame towards people. And I think that ties into what we were talking about earlier around caste. I think, and forgive me if I'm incorrect by saying so, I think caste is fundamentally always linked around honor. And you see the concept and the idea of honor and idea of is it being honor, if any was familiar, being spread across all within the South Asian diaspora, which is just, in my humble opinion, a really silly thing. But I can comprehend why it is sometimes people put such a form of social and worth under these kinds of issues. So I think that what we need to do as a collective, and as we are doing today, is push the dial and push these conversations, understand that there is going to be a lot of pushback. Sincerely, I don't think it's going to happen within our lifetime. I think it is a generational struggle. I think it is a generational problem to be able to take apart and bring apart that conditioning that's happened throughout all of millennia, through all of society. It's not going to happen today in one Zoom call, but what it will happen with is consistent, continuous allyship, meaningful allyship, working with our South Asian brethren from different faiths, from different backgrounds, to elevate and perform and create a safe space for others as well, because everybody needs to belong. Everybody deserves a place to be, and everyone needs to be seen and heard. And there's so much that is wrong within our society. But I'm really optimistic. I really am, honestly, because I see different organizations and different people collectively coming together and trying to provide solutions for these kinds of things. So always have that sense of hope, because the fact that we're here today on a Saturday, there's so many of us sitting here listening to what we have to say, means that progress is being made, continues to be as well. I remember that for the longest time I was searching for some place or some space to be able to talk about it. And now we're here having this conversation. And these things happen when people take meaningful action. So never lose hope. Understand that battles are really hard won, and there is no necessarily any final victory, and that's where you have to get up, dust yourself off, and do it again and again and again and again. And sure, it weighs on the spirit, and sure, it weighs on the soul, but it means something. Really, really matters. It really means something.
Fantastic, Nikhwat. Thank you so much. And I think you kind of answered the final question that I was going to just ask to all panelists. And so I'm going to open this up to the other panelists now as well, which is, if there's one thing we want our audience today, which is over 70 folks, to take away from this discussion, what is it that we want them to take away? That can be about things we've discussed, things that we can do to change and enable change in our communities. So I'm just going to hand that over to the panelists, and we can keep it short and snappy, and then we'll kind of go into our concluding remarks. So I'll hand it over to Shah first.
Just thinking about my own experiences, I think it is a lot. Like, it feels like growing up, there's always been all these different hats needing to put one on. When I am at home, I'm like the son, in the family, and then when I'm out with my friends, I'm completely different, and needing to sort of navigate that East versus West and sort of generational differences with my parents. So I think acknowledging that it is hard, but thinking about, I think for me, what's really helped is just having a network, or just having people that I know I can speak to, and that people who get it, and having a space. So I just encourage like people just to, I think at the start when we were thinking about our own sort of self-care, it is tough and it is hard. Thinking about maybe who is in your network, who do you feel safe to maybe speak to or have around you as someone who is an ally, someone who is supportive, someone who does get it. Because I think sometimes it can be hard to have those conversations with family. And I found for myself, it's been helpful to have maybe friends separate who I can speak to, who then have helped me have that, build up that confidence to maybe have certain conversations with my family. Whether it's about like going, when I was younger, even like going on a holiday when I was really young, that as well, that had a lot of challenges. So having, I think, that confidence, because it almost feels like I'm being a bad guy, like I'm being the bad guy. I'm in the wrong for wanting to do this. I'm in the wrong for wanting to be out past 10 p.m. So it's like having maybe a space where I can have those conversations, to voice it, that can help build up that confidence to sort of maybe speak to about with parents. Because it is, you know, I think what I found helpful as well, so I'm going on, but what I found helpful is I think when I've started to understand that my parents are from a different country and they see things differently, I used to get really defensive and angry about it. But when I started to just try and sort of understand that is how they've been raised and how they've grown up and their own experiences coming to this country as well, I think I started to be less angry and defensive, and started to maybe think about how can I communicate with them without that anger coming out. And that's something that was really helpful for me. So I guess just thinking about wrapping it up, just thinking about for you who might provide that space for you, if it is something, yeah, but I'll leave it there for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shah. Thank you for the time you shared with us today as well. I'm going to quickly go to Ravita, and there's actually someone in the class, in the chat, who's written, do you have any books and resources you'd recommend? But I'd like you to make your final comments for today's session.
I have loads of books and resources to recommend, but I'm big on documentary films. So if you want to check my page, there's quite a lot of resources there, and I'll be posting them after this session ends for anybody that's interested. There's a lot of documentaries and short films that I would recommend for people to engage with, because that learning is a very different kind of learning and engagement compared to sometimes reading. But of course, there are books that I can suggest as well. Just at the back of what all the panelists were saying in regards to boundaries, just a few comments I wanted to make as well. So I think Raj and Shah made some really good points alongside Nikhwat as well, where you were talking about boundaries. And I think it's really important for us to remember, when you're engaging, when we're talking about race or other aspects to our identity, and we're engaging with South Asian therapists, with white therapists who don't understand those specific experiences in terms of family dynamics, essentially what the panelists were saying was it's a re-traumatization, because you're already in a state of whatever it is that you're going through and whatever traumas you're experiencing, you're trying to access support, and then what you're getting back isn't culturally sensitive, and that can be quite traumatizing, and that is a re-traumatization within itself. That mirrors quite significantly with what I've seen in my work that I've been doing with caste, because whether you're approaching somebody who isn't from your community, or you're trying to access support through a South Asian therapist who doesn't quite understand your challenges with caste, there's a re-traumatization that takes place. That becomes a block, that becomes a barrier, and that is what is preventing people from accessing support with their mental health as South Asians and people from other ethnic minority communities as well. So I think we need to recognize that the problem isn't us if we face that. It's a re-traumatization that you're going through because the resources you've accessed aren't sufficient enough to deal with what you have reached out for in terms of your help. And some ideas and suggestions that I'd make, and just kind of to get the conversation going, hopefully after the session ends. So I just want to put a trigger warning out there because I'm going to be mentioning domestic abuse and suicide, is that when we talk about caste, it's not a surface level conversation, it's a serious discussion, and it seriously impacts and affects people's lives. And you know, it's really shocking when you actually start to speak to people who engage with this kind of work, what happens behind closed doors. It's very much a hushed discussion, particularly I find in the diaspora, because we like to think it only happens on that side of the border, in Pakistan, in India, in Nepal, in parts of Bangladesh. It doesn't happen here, but it does, it really does. There was a case, so Professor Meena Dande, she's on social media, she's on Twitter, she does a lot of work in caste discrimination, and she's written about a really upsetting and really sad case that she came across in her research in a journal called Casteism amongst Punjabis in Britain, and you can find it in the Economic and Political Weekly Journal. And there was a young British Punjabi living in Wolverhampton, and his mental health was seriously impacted because he was being bullied because of his caste status. He wasn't from an upper caste, and he tried to reach out for support. He wasn't getting it. He reached out to Professor Meena Dande because of the work she does. She didn't hear from him. 2 weeks later, she found from his sister he had taken, you know, he had died by suicide. What had happened to him in relation to caste meant that he felt like he didn't belong. That was how marginalized he felt within his own community. And that is really disturbing to think that that's happening in this day and age. That this happened, I think, around 2010, 2009, 2010. And the note that he wrote to Professor Meena Dande is in this journal. And it's a really upsetting read. And then people want to deny that or isolate this as this is only one case. But yes, this is only one case we know about. There are other cases I have come across in my work where young women who are in relationships, they are of dominant caste backgrounds themselves and their partners aren't. They've experienced domestic abuse at home, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse. And it's horrifying to think that this is happening to people even now in 2021. I recently received an email from somebody who's been engaging with me for a while, and with my posts and with my work, saying that, you know, I'm actually, the abuse I'm experiencing is really, it's getting to me, really mentally getting to me. What shall I do? And I'm suggesting seeking support or trying to find, you know, giving these resources, because that's the best I can do, because I'm not a mental health professional. But then I'm also very conscious of the fact that that re-traumatization may take place, because if you're accessing a South Asian therapist who also doesn't necessarily think that this is an issue, or is, you know, modeling their work off Baldwin and Freud and I don't know how many other white men out there, right? How are we going to then give this support to these South Asians that need it? So these are the kind of things that are happening in society and have happened, and it's happening in real time. And we need to recognize that it is. So whilst there might be a significant section of the South Asian community that is against this and is vocal and doesn't agree, fantastic. There's also a significant section of our communities where this is happening, and it's happening behind closed doors. And you might be surprised who it's happening to in your own circle. Because when I was doing this research, I was really surprised to find a long-term friend of mine had gone through something similar in a relationship, but had never mentioned it until I was doing this research, because these are the conversations we're not having.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raveeta. Absolutely, have the conversation, and I'm hoping that today is a push-off point for these conversations. Absolutely. So I'm just going to give it over to Raj for final closing comments, and then we're going to finish off for today.
There's only a few things you take away from this forum. I know we've talked about a lot of things, but for me, I would love if you took away the fact that you cannot pray your depression away. Mental health is real. It's not the result of some sort of you know, karmic punishment or the fact that you're not religious enough or God hating you. It's very real. You can't pray it away. Meditation does help with mental health outcomes, but it's not the only thing that you should be doing. And, you know, lastly, something I find in British communities is that, you know, this idea that you have to be quote unquote crazy to go to therapy. You don't. Like, you can go to therapy to deal with like the fact that you might be anxious or stressed about school, or, you know, working a lot, or unhappy in your relationship, or struggling to get on with your parents. Like, therapy isn't just for crazy people. You know, there's a lot that you can benefit from by speaking to a therapist. So yeah, if those are the only things you take away from this, I want it to be that you can't pray your depression away. Your mental health is real, and therapy is for everyone. You don't have to be literally on the verge of harming yourself or someone else to get help. There is no problem that is too trivial to take to a therapist.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raj. And thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing their experiences, their insights, their kind of real support for how we can overcome and continue these conversations in our communities around mental health and marginalisation. So if everyone could just take a very quick 2 minutes to complete the link I've just sent into the chat. This is a quick feedback form. The reason we are doing this is because, as we've mentioned, this is the first year we've run South Asian Mental Health Festival. We need to figure out what's worked well, what we can improve, and whether this is something that has actually connected with you all today in the audience. So if this is connected with you, if there are things we can do better, please just take a couple of minutes to complete that feedback form, because we want to bring this back next year, bigger, better, and more reflective of the communities that we serve. But I'm sure everyone today can give us a very warm thank you to our panelists, to our co-hosts, and to everyone who has been involved in this session today. So thank you all from myself, from the South Asian Mental Health Festival team, and we look forward to connecting with you all again and connecting with everyone in our next session, which starts in about 10 minutes time, which is a yoga session being led by Aisha. And so that'll be a nice opportunity to reconnect, you know, and have an opportunity to learn and practice in a different way. So thank you, everyone. Thank you all. And thank you to our panelists as well.